Welcome. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. This is the first big webinar that Black Sun has hosted, so I'm super excited to be here and so glad that so many of you guys can join us today. First off, I just wanted to say I hope you are all keeping safe and well amongst the fear and uncertainty for the well-being, I think, of our families, friends, and the community that we're all feeling at the moment. I know it's a difficult time, but I also wanted to say, personally, I've been overwhelmed by the generosity and support and interconnectivity showed by the NHS and the other essential services, and as well as the corporate community in addressing this crisis so far. And I'm really being impressed by the agility of so many organizations and the government to really proactively address the interests of employees, customers, suppliers, and the wider community in this difficult time. Clearly, at this point in time, nobody knows how catastrophic this outbreak might be for people in business and society over the long term, but I think it will be a true test of companies, of boards, of governments, as well as us as individuals, and I think society and how we work together, and I think that's the most important thing. And message for today is working together and sharing and engaging through this difficult time. And I think that stakeholder engagement and communications will be a vital part of really building on that trust foundation. And it's something, as you know, at Black Sun that we're very passionate about as a stakeholder communications company. And really, I also wanted to say that we're very privileged to work for a lot of companies and fabulous people over the time and have fabulous relationships with a lot of people. So I'm delighted today to share with you, which I hope will be a very informative session, a session with the FRC today to update us on some of the policy and the changes that are taking place. And I'm really pleased to have with us today David Rule, who's the Executive Director of Supervision, Mark Babington, who's the Acting Executive Director of Reporting Standards, Joyce Grant, who's the Technical Accounting Director of Conduct, and then Toomse-Smith from the Financial Reporting Lab. And each of them are going to share some of the recent things that have been taking place in their areas and share with you the policy and more importantly, what that really means for you as corporates moving forward. Now, I am just going to also reiterate before we begin that we're very passionate about keeping you up to date about what's going on. As Black Sun, we really feel it's very much our role to help corporates navigate this difficult time. And one of the things that we've done as a company is we've set up our own sort of little response hub where we're daily updating it with changing regulation and communication around what's going on and how that might impact corporates and how they communicate and report to the marketplace, as well as we'll be sharing lots of best practice with what we're seeing going on, as well as bringing to you lots of external people to share their views like the FRC today. So what I wanted to really do right now is to, first of all, thank everybody for tuning in, which is fantastic, and also particularly to thank the FRC for coming together as a team to be with us today and sharing with us some of their thoughts about what's going on. So now I'm going to pass it over to David Rule to take it over for the FRC. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Sally, and it's great to have this opportunity to speak to so many companies. So I'm going to be pretty brief. I'm going to hand over to our experts very shortly, but I thought I would just mention first of all what led us to the joint statement that we put out last Thursday with the PRA and the FCA. So it became clear to us very quickly after we moved to working at home and the social distancing measures were enacted, that in terms of corporate reporting, there were two main issues. One was the practical questions of how you operate and how auditors operate in this new environment with physical meetings now effectively impossible. So that was the practical questions. And then two, it was how you deal with the almost unprecedented level of uncertainty about the future of the economy, in the near future of the economy, and what that meant for companies and their business outlook. So any forward-looking statements in financial reporting were suddenly very difficult, and obviously this has all happened extremely quickly. So the first thing we did, and really this was the FCA in the lead, was decide that we needed a bit of breathing space. So the FCA put in place its 2-week moratorium on prelims, which has, I think, largely been observed, and which obviously runs out next week. Then we were thinking, well, what practically can we do to help? And obviously we can't remove the uncertainty, but we can help condition investors and other stakeholders to that uncertainty, and try to help companies to be at least consistent, reasonably consistent in how they approach that uncertainty. So the package, which probably you've all seen, but just to summarize the main measures in that, first of all, we wanted to give some more time for companies and auditors to do their work. So the FCA extended the deadline for filing of annual report and accounts by 2 months. And we strongly encourage companies to use that time to delay their prelim announcements as well, to take the time they need to do for them and their auditors to do the work. We then put out some pretty strong guidance to investors, and in particular to banks, to expect delayed reporting, to expect qualified audit opinions, and to expect material uncertainty on going concern. And in particular, that banks should consider the situation when responding, for example, to covenant breaches. We then gave some guidance to companies, which Joyce will talk more about shortly. We reiterated the importance of having effective controls and information flows, given that things are changing. We emphasized that companies should be aware of capital maintenance requirements, particularly if they're paying dividends. And in terms of corporate reporting, and more on this later, but what we're hearing from investors is that they primarily want to know what financing companies have available to them, what their financial position is, and then as much information as the company can give about their forward-looking cash flow position, the actions they have available to them, and things like stress tests and reverse stress tests. And we recognize that that's extremely difficult at the moment, given the economic uncertainty, but companies are asked to give as much information as they can. So that's all I was going to say by way of introduction. We're going to give you hopefully some information today, but we were also very keen to take the opportunity of this group to try to get some information from you. So hopefully the technology will work, but we've also got some polls that we will use to ask you some questions. So one is, what's your biggest challenge in relation to reporting at present? One is, how likely are you to delay the publication of annual report and accounts? And another is, how likely are you to delay your prelims if you're due to give prelims in the next few months? So I'll launch those polls now. Unfortunately, the technology doesn't allow a free text option, so we've just given you some choices. If none of those choices are the answer you would give if you had the opportunity, then please do contact us by email, because we are very keen to hear what are the problems companies are facing at this time. Right, I'm going to launch this, and then I'm going to hand over to Mark. Failed to launch. What's going on?
Okay, David, I think I beat you to it.
You beat me to it? Okay,
yeah,
you've got it up there already. Okay.
So we're fighting over control here.
That's absolutely fine. Right, I'm going to go on mute and stop my video.
Fantastic. So there you go. As David said, we've got 3 polling questions, which I think you'll all hopefully be able to answer. There also is a Q&A bar on your screen. So if you do have any questions, I'll be trying to ask some of those questions. So please send them in to me, and I will ask them of the panel at the FRC. I'll give you a few minutes to fill out the poll now. We've got a number of people online, so I'm just going to give it 2 or 3 minutes for everybody to have a chance to fill out those 3 questions. It'd be really helpful information. And just to reiterate, I think David's offer of getting in contact with the FRC if you do have more comments, I think that would be amazing. And then David, just while we're getting people to answer the poll, There was one question that we have had. Could I, if you wouldn't mind, if I just ask you now? And the question is really from a corporate, and it's saying, for those companies who have yet to print and mail their annual report and AGM documents this year, exceptionally, should they be able to circulate those documents to shareholders electronically, regardless of shareholders' stated preference for hard copy documents? So there are a number of companies that have yet to mail out hard copy and under normal circumstance would be required to. What would you be able to give any advice on what the requirement would be now?
So unfortunately, pass that on to government. I know they've very much been focused on general meetings and whether they can be held virtually, but I hadn't actually heard before the question about sending out report and accounts, but certainly we can make sure that that point is made with government. Oh, Sally, you're on mute.
Sorry, thank you. One other quick question that's just come up. Is there a view, and I think we'll probably pick this up later on, but is there a view on the announcement of interim results for companies for the September year end? And perhaps we'll cover that by Joyce.
Interims.
Yes, interim results for companies with a September year end.
Yeah, so I know that that's on the FCA's agenda. The FCA are kind of sequencing what they're doing, and they're very much focused on capital raising at the moment and facilitating that. But I know that interims is on their list of things to look at. Okay. I think, again, that's an FCA thing, not a FRC thing. Okay,
super. Okay, that's great. So I'm hoping that everybody was able to do that poll. Now what I will do is I will move on to Mark, as we said, and we'll hear from Mark now. I can just change the slides over to Mark. And just so all of you know, we will be sharing these slides afterwards. The FRC has kindly told us that we can share these slides, and there's lots of useful links in the slides as well. So Mark, without further ado, do you want to share with us next, please?
Thank you, Sally. I just wanted to take a few minutes to set out some of the things you might expect to hear from your auditor as you go into a year-end process. And this really builds on the guidance that we issued as part of the joint statement and the package of information to help auditors at this particular time. So some of the things that you may find happening in the audit process that might be slightly unexpected. The impact of coronavirus means that the risk assessment that the auditor carried out, probably earlier on in the year, will have to be revisited. They have to make sure that the audit approach that they develop is going to generate sufficient appropriate audit evidence for them. So you may find that the auditor comes back with further questions and requests further information in order to allow them to update that assessment and to decide how best to carry out the audit. The impact of the restrictions on movement will also have an impact on the way internal controls operate in an organisation, particularly for those who have March year ends. Certainly the processes in place over year-end cut-off may work differently, and where the auditor proposed to place reliance on those controls, they will have to update their assessment to ensure that they can do so. So you may well find more questions coming from the auditor about your year-end procedures. We'd also expect that they would have an interest in your business continuity arrangements, vote if they have, and also the impact. The auditors will probably want to do things differently. In a normal year, the auditors attend at the current period. However, may well be looking to do virtual. We've heard from auditors who, for instance, are participating in stock counts through a video connection and using technology as a way of participating in the audit and getting the assurance that they need. A big change in the audit approach with the work that's done over going concern, always one of the most fundamental parts of the audit, but this year taking on an even greater importance. So you can expect the auditor to be asking more questions and requesting more evidence in support of the director's assessment that an entity is a going concern. So expect to see more challenge of those assumptions, and expect to see a request for greater evidence in support of it, particularly reflecting what David said about the unprecedented uncertainty. One of the things that we all agree on is the importance of disclosure, and I think you should expect your auditor to challenge to ensure that the annual report provides as full and as clear a picture of the company's affairs as is possible. And we know that auditors will be challenging perhaps more than usual over the adequacy of disclosures, and of course the evidence to support those this year. Two further areas to raise with you. Firstly, there is of course an enhanced focus on subsequent events once the report has been signed, but before the financial statements are issued to markets. And you can expect that auditors will want to carry out work right up to the point at which the documents are released, and maybe requesting additional evidence. And finally, of course, the uncertainty that we face at the moment may result in auditors issuing more modified opinions. So it could be comments in respect of material uncertainty. It could be where they are unable to gain sufficient appropriate audit evidence, they have to consider the impact on their audit report. And what you should also expect in reports is that the impact of coronavirus may well become a key audit matter for the auditor, and they may refer to the impact in the way in which they describe the scope of the audit, about how their work has changed this year. But that gives you a very quick run through of some of the things to expect this year, and I'm now going to hand over to Joyce.
Okay.
Hello,
I was just going to say, Joyce, I think Mark had a few comments that Mark was cutting in and out, so it would be great if you could maybe stay close to your speaker when you're speaking. That would be fantastic. Thank you.
Okay, I will do that. Is that okay, sound-wise?
That sounds absolutely fantastic. Thank you.
Perfect. Sally, could you put up the slide with the detailed list of reporting issues on it for me? That would be really helpful.
The next one?
Next one. There we go. So starting off, just really picking up and reiterating what David already mentioned about the extension of the publication date by 2 months for the annual report and accounts. I think you've seen the poll results, and thank you for those who have voted on that, because it is going to be really interesting, I think, to see what decisions companies are going to make around using that extra time. I think the advice, from the FRC's perspective is, very much reiterating what David says, use that time wisely, and importantly, manage the expectations around the revised reporting timetable with, users and investors. Think carefully about the timing of your prelims, and liaison with your auditors on that will be really important, as always. And then for those who may be taking full advantage of the full 2 months delay, I think it's probably being careful to consider whether or not there's any other trading updates that are needed to the market in order to bridge that gap in reporting. So those are really the things I'd want to sort of say, just to reiterate what David was saying on the publication date. Then sort of moving on to the next section, which is ongoing concern and thinking about the material uncertainties disclosures. I think, first of all, just a reminder that, the going concern basis of preparing the accounts is appropriate unless management either intend to liquidate the entity or to cease trading, or there is likely to be no realistic alternative to doing so. So it's a high barrier to stop the going concern basis of reporting. However, in reaching that judgment, management do need to consider liquidity, solvency, operational implications arising from the crisis. And it needs to consider those factors, as we all know, for 12 from the end of the reporting period. But it's important to remember in this context that it's at least 12 months. So it's not limited to 12 months, at least 12 months for that going concern consideration. Then turning to sort of material uncertainties, because probably most of us have got out of the habit of having to think about such things, and I think that is about to come into kind of, quite sharp relief for many entities. I think when the going concern basis is still appropriate, management do still need to consider whether there are any material uncertainties, and those are uncertainties relating to events or conditions that cast significant doubts on the entity's ability to continue as a going concern. And these material uncertainties must be disclosed. It's important to make sure that discussions concern any material uncertainties, the viability report, and any associated key judgment disclosures are viewed as a package, and that the messages in all of those different places are consistent. Because I think, the communication, some of these messages are going to be, somewhat important. There's been a lot of scrutiny over those aspects of the reporting. Also, it's worth remembering that where the disclosure of material uncertainty involves a considerable degree of judgment, companies must consider the IS1 paragraph 122 significant judgment disclosures. That aspect was specifically considered by IFRIC and reported in their update in July 2014. And what that really means in practice is that even if management conclude that a material uncertainty doesn't have to be disclosed, it may still have to detail the basis on which they've reached that judgment in the judgments and estimates disclosures. Now, the company may prefer to keep all of their going concern and material uncertainty disclosure in place, and I can see that that's got a great deal of attraction to it. And so from that perspective, it would be acceptable to cross-reference from the material uncertainties note into the judgments and estimates section of the accounts. In determining whether or not material uncertainties exist, I think that companies need to pay particular attention, during the crisis to the uncertainty on any form and extent of government support. And it needs to be quite specific to the entity. And so, it will come down to what specific discussions have taken place with lenders in accessing that support. And for international groups, those considerations may need to be taken for a number of different jurisdictions. And that will depend on the form and status of the government support in those specific countries. So I think that's a complex piece of work, as I'm sure many of you are starting to realise. Then moving on to covenant breaches, we know that the FCA have given some guidance. I sort of think that as well as looking at the potential going concern implications, from a covenant breach perspective, you also need to consider whether or not there needs to be a reclassification of debt into current liabilities where covenants have been breached. Now, UK lenders have been advised, as we've seen from the FCA joint statement, to treat breaches leniently, but that might not be the same for all jurisdictions. And again, specific conversations and discussions need to take place with banks about covenant breaches and any associated waivers that you may get. So I think that's kind of all I really want to say on the going concern and material uncertainty disclosures. And then sort of moving on to an area quite close to the FRC's part in terms of monitoring reports and accounts, and that's the use of APMs. And I think we're all expecting that many preparers will want to use the flexibility of using alternative measures to highlight the impact that COVID-19 has had on the performance of their business. And that's entirely understandable in the circumstances. However, the reminder that the IFRS numbers remain the bedrock of the annual report and accounts, and that there needs to be sufficient discussion of the IFRS numbers within the narrative section of the annual report and accounts to ensure that there is equal prominence given to both the alternate measures and the IFRS-based discussions. The ESMA guidelines remain the best guidance for companies in how to balance that desire to use alternative methods to tell the story of the performance over the period, with the need for those discussions to be well connected to the audited numbers in the financial statement. Remember the key aspects of those guidelines, which is that alternative measures must be defined, they must be reconciled to the IFRS numbers, there must be good reasons for the adjustments being made, and above all, there needs to be equal prominence with IFRS reporting. One peculiar aspect of this crisis that perhaps we haven't sort of seen so much in the past is entities will be experiencing shrinking of revenues. And you might want to know how you discuss lost revenue in the front section, because that won't appear in any IFRS measures. And you may want to be giving some sort of indication as to what sort of revenues you might have reported had it not been for this crisis. And I think that particular aspect of reporting is going to be very difficult for companies. So that's my sort of using APMs. Moving on to a quick reminder about principal risks and uncertainties in the strategic report. I think it's probably fair to say that for many entities, we've not noticed that pandemic risk was previously featured very highly in the principal risks and uncertainty disclosures. And we suspect that a lot of companies may very well be taking the opportunity to rethink that. It's probably time to reconsider or update that, the principal risks and uncertainties, make sure there is proper reference to pandemic risk and specifically COVID-19. And it's important to remember that alongside that, there does need to be any mitigating actions that the company feels that they are able to employ. And as David mentioned earlier, looking at dividends and dividend policy, and again, Thomas will probably pick this up and cover it in a little bit more detail later. So just a quick reminder from me that where you're changing the policy of regarding dividends, it's important to make that to users in the accounts. I think it's also important for companies that the requirements to have sufficient distributable reserves to support the dividend payments is at the point the dividend is made, not where it is declared. And we know that normally in groups where dividends are made from subsidiary entities up to the parent, in order to create sufficient reserves in the parent company to make payment, close attention will need to be made to make sure that those payments up from subsidiaries are still able to be made in the current circumstances. It's going to be a really complicated exercise, I would envisage, in the current circumstances. And so you need to start early, and you will need to keep that updated right the way through until the dividend is paid, make sure that there is actually sufficient distributable reserves there. Then moving on to post-balance sheet events disclosures, there's a sort of fairly general agreement, I think, across, kind of most of those people interested in corporate reporting, that for December 2019 year ends, the events arising from COVID-19 are non-adjusting. However, for those companies that have got 2020 year ends, the decisions are going to be much more subjective. And I know we've already started in the FRC to think about whether there's any additional guidance we can give preparers with 2020 year end. But it's actually proving quite difficult to build any generic advice. There's so many factors in that judgment that's actually specific. So I suppose all we can say right now, when we will be looking at issuing further guidance, but for now, I think what's what to say is that, if you have a 2020 year end, it probably is going to be a matter of key judgment, particularly for those with January and February year ends. Then moving on finally to one of my sort of favourite topics, which is the judgments and estimates disclosures. And in my many years of reviewing accounts, I've always viewed the judgments and estimates disclosures as almost the engine room of how the accounts get pulled together. The first thing I do when I'm reviewing a set of accounts, look at the highlights page, read the audit committee report, have a quick look at the viability statement, linger a bit longer in the audit report, and then I head straight to the judgments and estimates. And in combination, they tell me a lot about the key judgments that management have taken in preparing the accounts and where the more subjective balances are and what the sensitivities are in those balances. And so the judgments and estimates disclosures are really important to me, and I'm sure they are to many other users. And it's fair to say they'll never be as important as they will be over this next reporting season, given the current crisis. And so I'd encourage all preparers to be as comprehensive as possible in discussing the key judgments that were the most significant when preparing those financial statements, and also to give as much information as possible about the assumptions they've used for balances involving estimation uncertainty. It's highly probable there's going to be a wide range of assumptions taken about the current crisis and the impact on any balances that are derived from forward-looking information. And the important thing is to clearly articulate what those assumptions were and what the sensitivity is to those assumptions. So I think the judgments and estimates disclosures are going to be really, really important to get right in this next season. And then I think if you could, that's right. Yes. Now it's just really to say I'm not intending to talk to this slide at all, but I had prepared. We've started to prepare some thoughts about where we might, the FRC might explore giving some more detailed guidance. And this is really the list of things that we've sort of landed on, or the short list of things that we've landed on so far. And so I thought, for the purpose of giving a little bit of an aide-memoire of those areas, the principal areas that rely on some kind of forward-looking assumptions. I thought it might be useful just to share that and put that into the slide pack so you've got that at hand. And that's really all I wanted to cover today, unless there's any questions.
Super. Joyce, that was really helpful. What I'm going to do is, I think that perhaps me being in control of this system is not the best idea, and I don't think the polling worked as well as I would have liked. So I'm going to launch the poll again, and please, everybody on the line, and I know there are 200 of you, so I'm looking for a lot of responses here. I'm going to launch the poll, and if you could all take the time to fill it out now. And then I do have one question for Joyce, really. I mean, that was an awful lot to take in, and there's lots of great insight there, which is really, really super helpful. And I think one of the things I picked up on is the need for fuller disclosure is more important than ever, is what you're looking for. Now, at such uncertain times, it's really difficult challenge for corporates, as you can imagine. What do you think is the most important message for preparers on the webinar that are listening to you today to take back to their boards in terms of focus and disclosure? What would your advice be if you could very simply get one or two messages across to the board?
I think the key message is that there's probably not going to be any right answer to landing on assumptions about the future. It would be wonderful if it was possible to get some kind of base case, that everybody could work off the same set of assumptions. I think that until, the crisis evolves some more and we have some idea about how we're all going to exit from it, that is probably just not going to be possible to pull together a base case. I know that that's something that, the joint regulators have been looking at. But I think in the absence of that, sort of solid base case that everybody can work off of, the only thing that companies can do is just really clearly articulate the reason why they landed on the set of assumptions that they did. In a sense, all that forward-looking piece is going to be about what was the base case that we selected as management, why did we select that base case, and if we were wrong, if it in terms we end up in lockdown for 6 months rather than 3 months, what would that look like in terms of the sensitivities of the numbers we've given? And I think just picking up what David was saying earlier about the importance of reverse stress testing, that is one way that, in the absence of almost any certainty about a base case, the reverse stress testing, so where, a company might say, well, we've assumed that the lockdown is going to last for 3 months and all our reporting is done on that basis, our estimates are done on that basis. However, we have 6 months worth of cash available or facilities available. That's the point at which we would then be, into the material uncertainty type world. And I think it's that reverse stress testing, I think, is going to be a useful tool for companies to be able to explain the parameters that they're working within. Okay. So I think that's my kind of, two things. You're kind of, very clear about what your base case is, and 2, reverse stress testing.
Okay, that's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. Okay, it worked. This is unbelievable. Thank you all. I'm going to see if I can share the results so you can see it. I think the attendees are now viewing the poll results, which is amazing. So we've had it's close to 125 of you answer. So interestingly, the most challenging thing, which is I suppose not surprising, is uncertainty about forward-looking judgments. Actually, I'm surprised that meeting investor expectations is so low, but I suspect that's because everybody's doing such a good job of keeping in regular dialogue and communication with their investors, and everybody is so uncertain about things. If we look down to number 2, it looks like the majority of people will not delay publication, although there are a few that will. And then in terms of preliminary announcements, actually, interestingly, a few more in there. And then obviously a lot where it's not relevant for at this particular time. So I think that's helpful. And maybe if the panel at the FRC could think about if they want to have any comments about that. I will now move over to Thomas from the Financial Reporting Lab. And he can share with us some of the work that they've been doing recently. And then we'll go to a Q&A from there. So I'll just move over to Thomas's slides.
Right, thank you very much, Sally. So I will just firstly say that if anyone hears screaming in the background, it's my teething 5-month-old. It's not an investor looking at their portfolio losses from the week. So for those of you who don't know about the lab, we're a part of the FRC, but we're slightly different from the rest of the FRC. Our focus really is on best practice and emerging practice. And we had been doing a number of reviews or projects that had been looking at business models, time horizons, risks, etc. Now, before the last few weeks, we'd very much been thinking about how companies might need to report or include in their disclosure some elements around the longer term time horizons. What we found in the last few weeks is those time horizons have sort of shortened down significantly for companies and for investors. So we decided it would be useful to go out and speak to investors and really understand from them what is the kind of key information that companies could put out at the moment that would help them in their response to the current issues. So we spoke to around 15 different investors. So that included some credit investors, some governance investors, some portfolio managers, etc. And we really asked them, what were the key things they were thinking about at this time. So kind of first insight that we got through that was that time horizons have really shrunk down into a couple of months at the moment, and broadly you could aggregate their views or their answers around certain key questions that they were seeking to answer. So I'm going to highlight those sort of 3 key areas and some of the questions and sorts of disclosures that investors were looking for in that sort of vein. So the 3 key themes that they were really considering were ability or clarity on resources, clarity on actions, and then clarity on the future. And obviously, investors understand that now is a time of uncertainty, but where there is information that is pertinent to their understanding, they were really keen to see that and understand that. In terms of resources, the kind of 2 top level questions they're trying to answer is how much cash does a company have, and what cash and liquidity could the company obtain in the short term. And particularly interesting here was, where is that cash within the group? Is it in the top co? Is it in the underlying companies around the globe? What's the ability to get access to that cash? How does that flow up? What kinds of processes and controls might need to be gone through in order to get that? In terms of cash and liquidity, they were really interested in understanding what types of short-term financing arrangements were available, whether that is a committed facility or a facility that the company has already got. What does it mean for covenants that you might already have? And whether there were any kind of other sorts of support that our business might be getting. Now, at this time, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of movement in the market, and it's not necessarily that investors will remember your specific company circumstances. And so there's a great value in communicating those and being clear on those. And that might be by re-highlighting or showing information or reorganizing information that you've already had out publicly. So many companies have started to think about updating their investment case, for example, to highlight some of those factors that are pertinent to the current situation that is relevant for investors to understand. So the second phase or theme that they were interested in was really around actions. So what can the company do to manage expenditure in the short term? And that was sort of both variable and fixed costs. So trying to understand impacts on dividend policy. Joyce mentioned dividends obviously earlier, and we've obviously also have seen a number of investors come out and talk about dividends and the expectations around dividends. Now, dividend policy is an area where we picked up before in the lab, but particularly it's one of those areas where I think as we go into next year's reporting, having a sort of a Section 172 lens, explaining really why you made the policy either to cancel or to continue with that sort of Section 172 lens is going to be an area where people are going to be interested. Also, particular area of interest, the lab's done quite a bit of work before on supplier financing, so reverse factoring and factoring type arrangements. Generally, investors had been interested in whether those elements were out there. Now they're really interested in what the longevity of those schemes are, what's the ability for the provider of those schemes to remove those, what does that mean for the company's working capital. So that's a key point that many investors raise with us. Information about capital expenditure, where you might have commitments, and also information about things like pension funding, as well as other things that you might be able to influence or manage. And I think this sort of actions area is also going to be of interest not just to investors but to suppliers, to governments, to employees and others. They're also interested in what kinds of actions the company is taking to ensure its viability. So particularly where you might operate across lots of different jurisdictions. What government support are you getting in those jurisdictions? What are the requirements that attach to that? Also, and as David mentioned, reverse stress testing and stress testing. Even if you can't necessarily be clear on everything, being clear at least on the things that need to clarify before you can move forward is also particularly helpful for investors. Intergroup guarantees and commitments becomes particularly important, and also details of how the board is monitoring the situation. We've had some discussions with a number of investors over the last couple of days, a number of companies over the last couple of days, and they've been talking about how their boards are meeting regular basis, demonstrating how a connected company with operations around the world, maybe they're learning from some of those other jurisdictions in which they're already based. So highlighting, thinking about how you're really showing how you're controlling the situation. And then the final phase is really the future, and we will probably be doing a lot more work on this ourselves in the lab as we move on, as we begin to transition out to the new normal. Because I think what's clear is it's not going to be the same as it was before. So some trends will have dramatically move forward. Some business models will significantly need to change. Some companies and operations and structures will be very different as we come out. But really highlighting, and it gets back to the kind of employee element, but also some of those other elements that are really important to driving long-term value, people, brand, licenses, etc. How are the decisions that you're taking now, how do those impact or might they affect some of these longer term value drivers? And as we move from a kind of reaction to the crisis to investors really thinking about the underlying individual businesses, that's going to be one of those key areas where they want to understand how you've done. So as I say, these are sort of 5 key areas that investors are interested in. As we move forward, the lab will be putting out other pieces of information, other reports that will support some of this insight, and also we hope to reference out some of the work that we've previously done, where we think there are some good examples that companies can have a look at. But that's my 5 questions element.
Super, Thomas. That was really insightful and really helpful. as well. And then just one of the questions I wanted to ask you, in terms of building on this work, are you planning to broaden this particular piece of work that you've done out in more detail moving forward?
So we've been thinking about whether we do some more detail on resources and actions, perhaps through blogs or other ways of getting the information out there, because as I said, we've done quite a lot of work previously on cash, which is really relevant now. So we did a report that came out last year, or this year in fact, on sources and uses of cash. Where is cash? Had some suggested disclosures in there. We've done stuff on viability, where we've talked about reverse stress testing, some good examples of that. So there's some really pertinent stuff that we can point to that's already been done. But particularly, I think the future aspect, looking at how companies' business models need to transition, that is going to be a really complex area for businesses, a difficult communication challenge. And it's one where I think the lab will look to see what we can do and how we can help. But just like the others, in terms of, if there's things that we can do to be helpful, we'd be really keen to hear about those. We'd really keen to receive emails and suggestions. Great.
I mean, that's really helpful news. Just if I may ask one question that came up from Mark, if Mark could maybe come off mute for a minute, is one of the things that I think we'd be interested in hearing is, again, there's a lot going on with the audit at the moment. For preparers on the line, what do you think the most important questions preparers should be asking of their auditors throughout this process, and how should they go about doing that? Do you have any advice?
Sallie, I think the most important thing at the moment is that we have time to carry out a proper audit. And one of the things that we've said, and we've done a lot of outreach with investors, is investors have been very clear that this is a time when high quality information coming into the market is really important. So you may well find that the timetable that perhaps you agreed with your auditor might no longer be deliverable because additional work has to be done, or it's harder to do that work. And I would encourage everyone to have a really open and frank discussion with their auditor right up front about what time pressure they may find, and to make sure that to the greatest extent possible, they can accommodate that within the flexibility that the FCA have allowed, for instance, over the filing deadline, or the flexibility allowed by Companies House. And if there was one thing to take away, it would be that.
Super. I mean, that's really, really helpful. Thank you for that. I just wondered if anybody from the FRC wanted to comment on the polls and what they thought about the results from the polls. Was that about what you expected, do you think, or?
So it's very, very interesting and very useful feedback, and we'll certainly share with the FCA as well. So on the biggest challenges, I think that's probably about what I expected. I imagine that the uncertainty about the future and the forward-looking judgments is going to be the most difficult thing. On the annual report and accounts and prelims, so I guess I'm wondering on two, whether some of the people saying do not intend to delay publication are not publishing in any case in the next couple of months or the next few months. But I do encourage people to use the delayed deadline where they need to, and also to delay prelims. So one of the things we were very keen to do, and the FCA was very keen to do with these announcements, is give corporates the scope to delay prelims if they need to, because they or their auditors need more time. And to be very clear to investors and other stakeholders that they shouldn't interpret that delay in any bad way. So if anybody's getting feedback from brokers or from anybody else that you cannot delay your prelims because it would be the worst thing in the world and investors will think it's terrible, then please push back, because that is not the message from the authorities. The message from the authorities is take the time you need, to do the work you need to produce your financial results. And we understand that it's going to take longer in the current environment. And that's why we've extended these timetables. And we encourage you to do that. And obviously, the more companies that do that, then the more normal it will be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very, very helpful advice for everybody, because it is a challenging time. I do feel a bit left out here because everybody from the FRC has got a very fancy background screen, and I'm going to get onto my team because you'd see the background of my room here. I'll just give it another minute or two to see if there are any further questions before I just run through some of the things that we're going to be doing to keep up to date. I wanted to actually thank the FRC for taking the time today. It was a very impromptu kind of webinar. I think I spoke to Thomas and Phil sort of earlier in the week, and we managed to pull it together for Friday. So, you know, a big shout out for everybody, Mark and David and Joyce and Thomas, for all being so flexible with their diaries and really getting in front. But I felt it was really important, with all the challenges I know that our clients are feeling, to really get something out there and a comment. And I think what's coming out loud and clear for me is the FRC is very open to have a dialogue with everybody. And if you have concerns, please do get in touch with them. I think they will be very helpful throughout this process, because it is challenging for everyone. And I just wanted to just talk a bit about what we're doing. As I said, we're tracking how companies are communicating. So you probably historically know us for a lot of our research that we do in the marketplace around the annual report specifically, particularly around our Complete 100, which is our trends and reporting of the FTSE 100. But most recently, my team is being hard at work, really trying to understand how companies are communicating around COVID and this crisis, and how they're using their website and other digital channels to really communicate more effectively with their other stakeholders, whether it's investors or other stakeholders throughout the process. And we will be continually keeping the market up to date on what's going on and publishing research reports on that as well. One of the other things that we didn't talk about, which I know is top of mind and would have been top of mind, I suppose, if we hadn't had this COVID crisis, is the climate and what's happening around that and reporting. And again, we're very on top of that, and have been also working with Thomas and Phil in the lab in terms of the climate reporting. And we will be following that and how companies are taking up TCFD disclosures moving forward. And just in terms of keeping you up to date, I always feel it's very important in these times to really share experiences and learnings. I think the challenge for a lot of corporates is that often is getting out there and hearing what others are feeling. I just want to say that Eddie is in the same boat in this one, and we are, as always, very happy to bring people together and try to create forums like this where we hear from people like the FRC and others in terms of what's going on, and as well have some sessions between corporates themselves so they can actually discuss free and frankly about some of these issues and how they're addressing them and learn from each other. So we've got a number of things that we will be focusing on in the next few weeks. We're committed to keeping our engagement program up. We've got a number of webinars that we'll be doing. I've just agreed one with Claire Laverly from Revell, who's a research company, and they'll give us a greater insight, really building on a lot of what Thomas has shared with us today. But Revell has recently done some research gained from a number of interviews with analysts and investors, not just in Europe, but North America, in terms of what they're looking for. So it really builds on the work that the lab has done. And we'll be sharing that next week, I think on Thursday. So if you're interested in that, we'll certainly send you out a note. We'll be doing a workshop on digital innovation, which is going to be more and more important than ever. Obviously, as well, a practical approach to ESEF. And I think, Thomas, it's the first time I've heard you talk where we haven't talked about ESEF, but we'll be picking up on that in terms of how to address ESEF, IXBRL, and all those interesting things. And then again, we'll be busy working on our Complete 100 research, which is the trends in reporting, and really trying to understand and make sense of all of this moving forward. So what I wanted to do is just finally check that there are a few questions.
Shall we have a shot at some of those?
Yeah, and
Sallie?
I will. Yeah, and I will see. I don't know if you guys can see the. One of the questions is, and I'm not sure if that you will be able to answer it, but it says, is there any indication whether the government will issue legislation for virtual AGMs? And I know this has been a big topic of conversation. So,
shall I just go? Maybe if I start at the, I'll just go through them, and then my colleagues can chip in.
Okay.
So on the final question on our previously announced projects, for example, Kingman, the answer is that a lot of that is currently on hold. Government's made clear that the priority at the moment is dealing with coronavirus and, to a lesser extent, the negotiations with the EU on EU exit. And other things are going to be delayed, and we are following that lead. So although these remain clearly important for us, the timetable, I think, will be extended. Is there a huge risk that the value of the audit report is undermined by modified opinions becoming the norm? I don't see that as a huge risk, because I think audits are going to jump to that option as a first preference. But Mark may want to jump in on that in a moment. Any indication when the government will legislate for virtual AGMs? I'm afraid I don't know that, but it is one of the things that we will feed back from this call to our contacts in BASE. What percentage of company reports are you likely to modify for material uncertainties? I couldn't give a percentage. I mean, we've said that these are inevitably going to be more frequent in the current highly uncertain environment. But I'm not going to give a number, not least because this is a moving target, and the government support package is being explored and used by companies, and we know that a number of companies will raise capital. So this is a moving target, but I think it will be certainly a bigger number than previously. Can companies with March year ends assume they have the full 6 months? Yes, I believe they can, although I hesitate to speak for the FCA, so you might want to talk to them directly, but that, I believe, was the intention of the extension. And then remuneration, I am not an expert. Joyce probably isn't either, but she may want to comment on that one. So maybe I'll hand over to Joyce and then to Mark to see if they want to add to anything I've said on those.
Yeah, just picking up the director's REM reporting, it's, as you say, it's not an area of expertise for me either, but I think I would probably put this in the category, you know, that's almost been a pervasive point throughout the whole of this presentation, which is that companies are going to need to be far more open about what they disclose and the reporting that they put around pieces. And given that we know that the attention paid to directors' executive pay is unlikely to be diminishing anytime soon, it would certainly make a lot of sense to me that companies may want to give fuller explanations about where they land on applying discretion not to the outcomes for 2019 year ends. So I would sort of say, in the current environment, I would expect that that's something that, you know, users more generally would want to see more disclosure of. So I would probably agree that yes, it would be important to explain.
Can I just add on the auditor's report question? Some regulators globally have issued effectively boilerplate text for auditors to use to deal with the coronavirus issue. We chose very deliberately not to issue any such guidance because the auditor's report needs to be tailored to reflect the particular facts and circumstances of any entity. So although, as David says, we expect the current circumstances to lead to a higher number of modifications, we've been very careful in engaging with audit firms to say that you have to draft those reports in a way that is going to be useful to the user of the annual report and is going to help support their decision taking. So we have certainly gone out of our way to avoid any sort of generic reporting.
Super. Okay, I think we've had time to answer most of the questions. If there are any other questions, please either send them direct to the FRC or on to us, and we can forward them on to the FRC. And I think I just wanted to say a massive thanks to David, Mark, Joyce, and Thomas for taking the time this Friday afternoon. It's sunny outside. I hope everybody enjoys a lovely weekend. And stay safe, everyone. Stay in touch, and thank you, everybody, for keeping engaged and, you know, supporting each other through this time, because I think that's really important. So I hope to be in contact with many of you soon, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thanks very much,
Thank you,
everybody.
Sallie, for organising.
Okay.